Afternoon, folks. Good afternoon, folks. Gord Cook, Building Knowledge Canada. Thanks for joining us. We'll wait a few more minutes for a couple others, but pretty excited to have our guests on this particular session, climate adaptation and mitigation. There's no doubt in my mind as I travel, this is the next thing that our industry will need to respond to sooner rather than later. So we'll just give it a minute or two or see who else joins us. And I'll say again, a few more have joined us that my name is Gord Cook from Building Knowledge Canada. Very pleased you're with us here today. We've already put a couple of items in the chat. And I'll just remind you, if you do have questions, use the Q&A section as opposed to the chat. That way we can monitor and make sure that they get answered correctly. We can actually record the answers as well. So by all means, ask questions, but put them in the Q&A section, please. But please refer to the chat just for a couple of housekeeping notes. And again, we'll just wait another minute or so. I will say while we're waiting, we're always pleased. It's been a wonderful partnership for us with Enbridge, and in today's session in conjunction with the LEAP program at CanMet. But it's always been our pleasure to present these webinars to the industry. Just the range of topics has been it's been really cool over the last couple of years. And this particular one, climate adaptation and mitigation, is one often we're responding to code change and sort of immediate things. This is something that needs to be put on your agenda sooner rather than later, but perhaps a new topic for some of you. And we have a really interesting speakers today to help you with that. I see, Stacey, we're up to 60. What's our magic number? How many did we say before we get started?
Yeah, we're probably going to get some laggers here because we've got almost 300 that have registered, but they're probably enjoying the last bit of sunshine here today.
I think I get paid by person, don't I? So good. Just in the interest of time, I think we will get started. And one last time, I'll say thank you very much for joining this, our series of webinars, Critical Canadian Building Science webinar series, hosted by, or sponsored by Enbridge Gas, and we're always pleased to work with them here at Building Knowledge Canada. The agenda for today is we'll do some introductions, of course, and then we'll have Stefanie set the context for the resiliency, the mitigation and adaptation for climate change. And then I'll have a few words to say about how I feel the building industry has already responded on the mitigation side. We'll want to hear from Carl as well as to how Minto's doing that. For some reason, my lights just went out. My apologies. And then back at the second topic of adaptation. So that'll be pretty interesting. And then we'll have a chance for question and answers to move us along. We'll go to the next slide. And just some of you have been on this before, but we'll go through the housekeeping rules. As I mentioned before, if you have questions, place them in the Q&A. It's much better for us, much better for you, for everybody. And then, of course, be considerate, thoughtful, and respectful in the chat. It's always been, we've not had an issue with that, but understand that, you know, it's a varied crowd from across the country. So we want to be mindful and respectful of that. We are here to help you. Stacey Cooper's online. If you have issues, you can send her a chat if you're having trouble connecting. This webinar is recorded and is available after the presentation. We do ask you complete the Survey Monkey, whether you may know it or not. Your survey results we use extensively to help us guide presenters and presentations over the next year or so. And the links to the presentation materials will all be sent out to you after the webinar. Closed captioning is enabled if you require a live transcript. So thank you for that. We'll go to the next slide. And we always like to know who's here, so we have a couple of polls, if you wouldn't mind answering the poll. Where are you from and what keeps you busy? So we'll start with that. If you could please answer here. And Stefanie, I'm going to rely on you to kind of tell us when we've reached a critical number, and then you can click to show us the results.
Okay, sounds good. I'm happy to do that. Wow, looks like we're almost at 80% participation, so that's good. Looks like about the majority of people, about 75% or so, are from Ontario. We've got a good contingent from British Columbia, but we have other provinces here, pretty much all of them except the Atlantic provinces and the territories.
Great.
We have representation.
So, the results,
oh,
yep, there's the results. Thank you.
There you go. Share results. Can you see that? Okay.
Scroll down. Is anybody from the US?
No, not yet.
Oh, okay, that's fine. But thank you all for joining. Really appreciate that. Nice to have that cross country. And then a quick poll on what keeps you busy. We're always pleased to have the full gamut of folks. Really love having building officials online, and of course, architects, engineers, the energy evaluators, consultants. So thank you all.
Well, it looks like, yeah, we've got quite a few builders, engineers, architects, consultants, energy advisors, building officials, pretty much everybody. But here we've got a lot in the other category. So about 25% of the attendees are in the other category. That may be
and
curious.
I noticed Alan mentioned, and by all means put it in the chat, that he's with an NGO. So thank you for that. And there was a bunch of others. So anybody who's put themselves in the other column, that way we could add that category to future polls. So that's kind of nice of you. But we didn't put a place there for government officials. That's interesting. So the NRCan folks have joined us as well. So thank you for that. I don't know if we should put NRCan specific or maybe just make it all government agencies. That's great. Good. Okay. So thank you. Yep, there we are there. Thank you. Good. And so we'll go to the next slide.
Just a sec here. There we go.
So as I say, we're always very pleased and thankful that Enbridge sponsors this webinar series. They're always very gracious and respectful of the fact of what our audience needs to hear. And so we always like to ask an Enbridge rep to participate. And Michelle Nicotin, the advisor for residential sales of residential new construction, wants to say good afternoon. Michelle, nice to see you.
Yes, Gord, thanks so much for having me. And hello, everyone out there in the web world. You can advance, Stefanie. Wonderful. We would like to start today's session by acknowledging that the land in which we gather is the traditional and historical lands of the original people of Turtle Island, who have been the caretakers of these lands since the time immemorial. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Our acknowledgement of this reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and the relationship to Indigenous people, and we have the responsibility to honor that. Next slide. So here at Enbridge, we typically start most of our meetings off with a quick safety moment, just to become a little bit less complacent and to remind everybody. So the one that they chose for me to present today was what to do if you damage a natural gas line or come across a damaged line. So obviously you're going to stop work immediately. Hopefully it doesn't look as bad as that picture, but my goodness. Clear everyone from the area. You're going to call 911 if you do smell or hear gas escaping, and then you can call the Enbridge gas emergency line. More than likely, the fire department will do exactly the same thing, but it couldn't hurt to call us as well. And again, yeah, just keeping the area clear is one of the biggest, most important items on that. Next slide. And this is just our slogan right now. We are trying to pivot with the ever-changing, evolving energy structure right now. So we always say tomorrow is on, we're ready for it, and Enbridge is here to help. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Michelle. I was very pleased yesterday to speak at the First Nations Building Officials conference in Ottawa. It was just mindful of it was just a great cross section from across the country of various First Nations. It was quite an honor to speak to them and see some of the really innovative stuff. One of the things that was brought up, if you take all the houses built in First Nations across the country, they end up being one of the largest home builders in the country. So lots going on, and thank you for that land acknowledgement. So we'll move to the next slide, Steph. So introductions, I won't do much on myself, but I am the president of Building Knowledge Canada. Just been really pleased. It says 25 years, and that's because that's an old picture of me. If you saw the picture today, you'd have to say it's probably more like 35 years, and indeed it is now 35 years. And I just really love the building industry and understanding where things are headed. And we just try to help builders build better houses, and I love this opportunity. So thanks for that. Most importantly, I'm really pleased to introduce our two guest speakers for today. If you could go to the next slide. Stefanie Coleman, I'll let you read while I just banter with Stefanie a little bit. Stefanie, this is a pretty interesting topic for you because you started out in the renovation world as a builder contractor, then you were with us as an energy consultant, and then you went to one of the most proactive builders in the province, Doug Terry. But all along the way, you've been doing your own personal education on this through your master's program. So just say hello and help us understand where you are these days.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much, Gord. Yes, it's been quite a journey over the last number of years, and exploring further education around the environment and business at Waterloo really really informed me to things that I had no idea was going on outside of my bubble in construction. And so it's really caused me to change and pivot in the direction that I've been moving in. And so it very much influences the work that I'm doing today, including the PhD in sustainability that I'm in the first year of. It's really influencing kind of how my life and career path has gone. And I'll be talking about some of it today.
Exactly. And Stefanie's currently working, as you see there on the screen, with, if you don't know the LEAP phrase, the Local Energy Efficiency Program, which has been really impactful in helping builders find and use cost-effectively new technologies. So this particular one in the Greener Neighborhoods pilot program is pretty cool. And next slide, if you wouldn't mind. Our other speaker is Carl Pawlowski, which he's been on some of these, I think, before, and he's certainly been a speaker for us at our spring training camp. And Carl is the Senior Manager of Sustainability at Minto Communities Canada. And he looks too young to be having a decade of experience in leading the sustainability strategy. But indeed, Carl, you've been at it quite a while now. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Just over 10 years now. And, I think we're seeing this evolution towards climate adaptation and mitigation. And that's what I'm going to share the builder perspective on today.
And it's your day-to-day world. It's probably not the day-to-day world of the building side of the company, but in the sustainability side, I know this is now taking up a big part of your agenda. So thanks for sharing what you've learned. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. And Stefanie, you wanted to start off with just a little bit of context of both. And I love the fact that you're going to talk about two different words. It's important that we, in the same way that we talk about operational embodied carbon, there's kind of two facets to it. In terms of this topic, there's the mitigation and adaptation. So we're going to rely on you to set the stage for that, please.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Gordon. Thanks for the opportunity to present alongside with Carl. This is a lot of fun. So thank you. So first, I'm going to talk about what is mitigation and adaptation. What do we mean by that? Why is it important, and how it's impacting the housing industry? And this is based on the studies that I talked about in my own research. So I'm sort of wearing my personal hat for the next few minutes. So what do we mean by mitigation and adaptation? So if we were to think about sustainability as our goal, mitigation is how we get there on the energy and carbon side. So you'll be familiar that we spent a lot of time in energy over the last number of years, really focusing in on energy conservation. And then now we've been talking about carbon and carbon reduction, whether it's operational or embodied, and our overall impact to the environment. So that's when I'm talking about sustainability and mitigation. That's what I'm referring to. When I'm talking about resilience, again, being the end goal, adaptation is how we get to resilience. And so this is where we're looking at reducing risk from extreme weather events and climate-related change that we're beginning to see. So when we think about sustainable homes, they have reduced energy demands and carbon. Resilient homes have reduced risks from climate-related weather events. So why is mitigation and adaptation important? I found these two statements, and some of you may have seen this in the past, but the Council views climate-related financial risks as an emerging threat to the financial stability of the United States. This was a statement made by the U.S. Financial Stability Oversight Council that provides guidance to the federal government in the U.S., the Department of Energy, Federal Reserve, etc. In Canada, just a year ago, our own regulator for financial and insurance industry said very much the same thing, that climate change and the global response to the threat it poses the potential to significantly impact the safety and soundness of federally regulated financial institutions, so being banks and insurance. And so that was a real wake-up call for me when I saw that. Simultaneously, I noticed that both the securities administrators in Canada, as well as the Securities Exchange in the States, who are the regulating bodies for publicly listed companies, had put forth requirements for climate disclosures, and specifically focusing in on GHG emission disclosures, as well as climate risks. And I was super curious as to why, the finance industry was so interested in ESG reporting and this in this topic. And so what we're starting to see is that there's this emphasis on mitigation and adaptation. And we'll talk about why this is important for the finance industry. But sustainable resilience, which is sort of the outcome of mitigating and adapting our homes, is sort of the desired end goal. So it's not that we just do one or the other. The idea is that we need to do both. And if there was any sort of question as to, why finance is looking at moving forward with ESG reporting, or whether they're moving forward with ESG reporting, you can see these are the top 10 U.S. publicly traded builders. Their ESG reporting, particularly around climate, but also on other topics. And you'll see that some have been doing this for many, many years, and others have just in the last couple of years begun to do their reporting, particularly around climate and social issues. And so clearly there's a trend because as of a year or so ago, this was completely voluntary. So it was very clear that there was movement on this front. So let's talk about sort of why finance and are interested in this particular topic. So when we look at the home buying system, and this is just very high level, you've got a buyer and you have a seller, whether it's a builder or it's a resale. And generally speaking, this transaction of cash for a building depends on lending, usually. Lenders require insurance. So if anything happens to insurance, then it can impact the lender, which can then impact whether that transaction goes through. But similarly, if you were to own a home and you don't have insurance, that's a pretty significant risk. So what we're beginning to see, however, is that climate change, at least as we're seeing in the States and we're starting to see here in Canada, is beginning to create some problems and some crises for insurance. And so some of the headlines that I had seen over the last year or so was, insurance crisis in Florida, California, Louisiana. We've heard Texas and other places where there's these concerns about insurance because of climate change and the extreme losses that we're beginning to see. And so this graphic here shows that. On the left, the Bank of Canada back in 2021 did a report by postal code looking at the areas of the country that were at risk of anywhere from 1 to more than 3 individual different types of hazards layered on economic vulnerability. And so they mapped that out, and we're looking at this several years ago. And on the right, you'll see this is insured catastrophic losses. So you'll see that there's this escalation in insurable losses that are occurring because of climate-related events. Now, of course, there's many factors that are driven by that. There's more buildings, that exist. The cost of buildings are going up. So some of that drives that, but we're also seeing far more storms and also more intense storms. Now, complicating that is we have what I call the housing rush. And so that's where we need to build a bunch of homes, but that's sort of clashing with this escalation in climate risk. And so as we build more homes and as we're seeing an escalation in climate risk, there is more risk essentially related to the homes that would exist. Because presently, where the building codes are at, but where they're going, where they're presently at, we haven't quite hit tier 4, tier 5. Adaptation measures like overheating is being looked at for the 2025 cycle, but then we're not seeing other adaptation measures at least yet. Some, but not all, until we get into, like, say, 2030. And so there's more risk. And so, how do we help to reduce that risk? And so the idea here is it's through reducing our carbon emissions that's creating the problem, while also adapting our homes to be more resilient against the problem of climate change. And so this graphic sort of illustrates that. You've got sort of the cause and effect. You have emissions that are affecting our weather systems, which are then damaging our homes. So we need to rebuild, creating more emissions. So creating this sort of feedback loop, and mitigation and adaptation helps to stop or to break that cycle. So the question is, and to sort of reinforce the point, and I asked this sort of tongue in cheek, if these homes were built to net zero or net zero ready, how many tons of carbon would we have saved, after they've burned down or blown down or flooded? And, and so that is a real question. If you have to build them twice, all of the effort put into making them low carbon and low energy in the first place is really undermined when we lose the house. And so to protect our investments on the mitigation side, we should be looking at what we need to do to adapt the homes so that we don't lose them, notwithstanding the social issues that are tied to losing the home. Now, I just wanted to show you, again, this is part of my academic studies, and so this is all with my academic hat on. I wanted to show you some observations that I've had just over my years of experience working in industry, and sort of mapping out this so that it sets the stage for what I'm going to talk about later as it relates to the work that LEAP is doing on mitigation and adaptation. So what I've observed is that when, say, a problem is identified, a bunch of research is done around that problem to identify, like, what the problem is, right? And so we can understand the problem. And so we have regulators, academia, manufacturers, and others that do a bunch of research around the problem. And then the next sort of logical step is that we develop guidelines and standards on solutions or what we should do to address the problem. Now, often what is the next step after that is you'll have sometimes a labeling program could be developed around, the standards and guidelines, or but oftentimes you'll have industry leaders, very much like the builders that would be on this webinar, who will go out and voluntarily trial some of these standards and guidelines. And so what happens when they go to trial these, this is where you begin to put what was designed into practical application in the real world. And so you begin to implement, or figure out the how to implement these standards and guidelines. And then oftentimes standards and guidelines that have been designed to address problems then get proposed as code change requests. And so this is where industry typically gets much more involved at a higher level. And not just home building industry, but all different, industry and stakeholders that are around that particular standard or guideline that's being proposed as a code change request. And so this is where oftentimes you can get a lot of resistance or pushback to the proposed code change because issues that are surfaced are often come around affordability of the changes, or the buildability or the constructability of the changes, where there's some challenges there. And then from there, one of, generally three things can happen. You could have whatever the proposed code change request was put through is just denied. So it's rejected and doesn't move forward. You could have sort of a diluted version where it's, maybe it's been it gets modified so that it's not exactly as it was originally, or it could be put through all the way through. And so those are the sort of outcomes that can occur. I know in this year in Ontario, a code change request had been put through for a measure to address high winds, and it ended up being rejected at the code stage. So as an example, so that's just an example of kind of where we're at. So this is the sort of process that I've observed occur. But what I noticed was there was a gap with involving industry early in the process. And whether it's, industry's availability to participate, or being invited, or however it is, it doesn't really, matter so much as we really need to hear industry's voice early on, so that as we work through these things, we know that whatever is being designed and developed and proposed is buildable and is affordable. So I'm going to stop there, Gord, and hand it over to you. But this will just set us up for our next phase of the conversation.
And thank you, Steph, though I wouldn't mind highlighting just for a second.
Sure.
I believe the recent flood in Quebec prompted Desjardins Insurance to say they were going to stop offering flood insurance. And then a second comment, I was working with one of the large national builders, one of the ones that you showed in the US, who are this year in 2025, they're one of the top 3 builders, have told all of their divisions, every house must be Energy Star qualified. Mm-hmm. And we asked, where did that come from? Oh, they said that was from Vanguard. They're one of their major investment groups, required them, compelled them, and said, we need you to take a step up. And yes, some of your divisions are doing it, but we need all divisions, all houses. So it was actually their investment company that said they have to do this, and undoubtedly for many of the reasons that you're speaking of. So then if I could highlight that, and you're seeing the same thing, Steph, I'm sure, in all your work. Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's fascinating. I love that story to hear, to validate kind of the reality of what I've been reading and hearing from others.
Yes. I'm showing this phrase that we often show at the end of sessions that we do, sort of an inspirational message by John Ruskin, who was an architectural historian back in the 1800s, and just love this phrase, right? When we build, let us think that we build forever, not for present delight nor present use alone. Let it be such work as our descendants will thank us for. And we often think of that from an aesthetic standpoint, for example, beautiful looking houses. But I think it takes on a new, based on what you've said, Stefanie, it takes on a new responsibility. If you imagine a builder in the 1800s, what they saw coming forward, they may have been thinking about energy, they may have been thinking about comfort and so on, maybe housing crisis, number of houses, but I don't think they would have foreshadowed or known the kinds of risks that we're at. And I think there is a responsibility. This slide shows that there is a responsibility for the building community to look not just at the code changes in 5 or 10 years, but imagine if you're driving down the road 50 or 60 years from now, and looking back at the houses that you've built to say, I wonder if the decisions I make today, how they will look in 50 or 60 years. And it's one of the things I like best about the building industry is everybody, and rightly so, is very proud of what they build, understand that houses are going to last for generations. And so we do need to think about this particular topic. So let's, what I would like to highlight, if you go to the next slide, is I feel like we have a bit of a head start, at least from the science perspective. That is the research in energy efficiency. And it was primarily developed around the energy efficiency crisis in 1977, the mid-70s, Harold Orr and some of the other folks that we are so proud of. They did all that research that helped us develop the science of building and the energy efficiency of buildings. And they also came up, though, with this idea of the house as a system concept, where understanding that unintended consequences consequences. And our partner Andy's talked about this a lot, that everything impacts everything else. That if you just put more insulation into a building, you actually could reduce its durability. You have to think about air, heat, and moisture flow. And really, we came to the conclusion, the building industry came to the conclusion, that you never want to compromise health, safety, comfort, or durability for energy efficiency. That said, energy efficiency, I think you would agree, is one of our steps towards mitigation. I didn't know it at the time, but I always like to say, you know, my career in indoor air quality and energy efficiency has been my two areas of focus over the last 40 years or so. Those also help with the mitigation and perhaps the adaptation side as well. So I think the industry's off to a nice start. Are you okay with me saying it that way, Stefanie? That at least we have a starting point here.
Yes, I would certainly agree with that. Yes.
Thank you. And we'll go to the next slide. And I would say that the nice part is some of the voluntary energy programs that are respectful of the science have in fact led us forward a little bit, right? Programs like our 2000, the historic program that was 40 to 50% better than code. Programs like the Energy Star program, the most popular energy efficient in terms of number of houses built ever. Now solidly over 2.5 million in North America, 150,000 of those in Canada. Programs, I'm so proud of CHBA and their Net Zero Ready program and Net Zero Home, the passive host folks and so on. All of these programs clearly focused on energy, but that plays nicely into the operational carbon mitigation side. So I think we all get to take a bit of a credit for at least starting towards where we need to be. So we'll just go to the next slide. And what I would say is there is a connection then to this resiliency side, the mitigation and adaptation side, because the same things that we do to make houses more energy efficient also provides more thermal resilience during power disruptions. We know anecdotally during the big Quebec and Eastern Ontario ice storm that our 2000 houses fared much better. They took weeks to freeze. I know in my own net zero place, we lost power for 26 hours on a very cold, very windy day. And it lost less than 1.5 degrees Celsius over that 26-hour period. So just the thermal improvements alone give us some thermal stability, if you will. It also gives us durability with respect to wetting risks. That is, we learned very early on with the science that you can't just add insulation without impunity, that you have to manage water better, both in terms of liquid water and airflow, making houses tight. And in my own world, the healthy indoor environment that is the R2000 program, the Energy Star program, the Net Zero programs have always required balanced ventilation as part of their program, understanding that if we build an energy efficient house, it also needs to be healthier. So it helps us, for example, on the wood smoke days where we are being buffeted by wood smoke, that we have control over the outdoor air, we can filter it and so on. And I would like to suggest that we have more robust HVAC systems, things that often include dual fuel options, at the very least, not needing a lot of heat, smaller pieces of equipment, less need, if you will, for heating and cooling. So that's pretty useful. And then, of course, as I mentioned, on the operational carbon side, reducing greenhouse gas emissions well into the future, house we built today under some of these programs. And Carl, I'll bring you into the conversation. This has been part of your world, is taking the legacy even before your time at Minto of the efforts of energy efficiency and now moving them on to the next piece of mitigation and adaptation. So help us understand where Minto's been on this journey.
Yeah, and it's been, 10 years here at Minto, like that journey has come from a very simple perspective on the environment and energy to now really linking sustainability with climate resilience and the future of what we need to do as home builders, right? So I think that's fantastic. Yeah, next slide there, Stefanie. So I'm going to give a little context of about Minto, what we work on, so that'll sort of frame the discussion when I'm talking about mitigation and adaptation strategies. And then I'm going to come back later on to really get into the adaptation side of things, and then speak a little bit about our mid to longer term strategy moving forward.
Thank you.
So very quickly, you know, Minto was founded in the mid-50s. We build in Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, British Columbia, Florida, South Carolina, now Texas. So we're, you know, a little bit all over the place. So you can imagine building low, mid, and high rise and for sale condos and purpose-built rentals. And we have existing apartments. There's a varying approach to not only sustainability and ESG, but also climate resilience and the types of risks that we face. So there's a diverse set of things that we need to consider, and teams and divisions that we need to collaborate with. You know, we've built more than 100,000 homes throughout our time. We've got currently over 11,000 rental units and 1,300 staff between Canada and the US. Just next slide there, yeah. So why, as a home builder, is all of this important to us? I mean, you know, at the root of it all, it is part of our reputation. It's part of our brand. It's part of the way that we do business. But there's also the risk and transitional risk to the business of not adjusting to addressing these types of challenges, right? We want to make sure that we are securing partnerships with people and those that are like-minded. We need to ensure business continuity for, you know, our communities that we serve, our customers, our employees. So there's, you know, many things related to our reputation and business resilience. A lot of this is driven by our ESG strategy, which we released back in 2020. And that sort of ties everything together, right? The business resilience component, community impact, and the environmental side of things. And then obviously we know codes are moving down this path, so we want to be a step or more ahead of that. So that's sort of how we frame our strategy and where we want to be in that curve. And if we go to the next slide, you know, early on through our ESG strategy, we did what's called a materiality assessment. So this is the matrix, that's the outcome of that. So we spoke with investors, partners, customers. We asked our employees, we asked our senior management team, sort of all the stakeholders that are involved. And if you look very clearly in the top right there, emissions and climate resilience, aka mitigation and adaptation, were the top two in terms of significance rating and stakeholder rating. So that was very clear to us where we need to focus our efforts. Next slide. And a lot of information here, but essentially this is summarizing the types of risks to the business, right? So you've got policy and legal implications, we've got technology risks, we've got market conditions that, you know, that can be impacted by climate, and reputation, as I mentioned. So like this is very thorough understanding risks at a business level. And then if we go to the next slide, you'll see more of the I guess, conventional physical risks that most of us think about when we think about climate change, right? So there's acute, very specific events, and then there's sort of mid to longer term chronic stressors as a result of climate change impacts. So this is how we frame and this is how we talk about climate risks. And if we go to the next slide, and keep going to the next one, I'm going to talk about some of the strategies that we currently employ on the mitigation side. So, you know, I think there's been a lot more work in this area. We know the recipe, right? We're talking about operational and embodied carbon, you know, emission avoidance. So again, a lot of things that Gordon and Stefanie have mentioned, right? We're talking about optimized envelopes, better air tightness, optimized insulation, better windows. And then we're talking on the mechanical side, how to reduce those carbon emissions, whether that's through a dual fuel system, all electric, or going down the renewable energy path, which has sort of become our standard with Geo Exchange on our high-rise communities. And then what we're still sort of working on is that mid-density product around net zero or near net zero carbon. So that's your stacked townhomes, which prove to be a little bit more complex, but we know the CHBA through their net zero standard have their new alternative compliance path. So we're going down and looking down that route. And really what we're trying to do as a production builder is how can we scale that to the community level, right? We've done homes, we've done blocks of townhomes, we've done sections of a community, but we want to look at how can we bring that to the whole community level. Next slide. And then on the embodied carbon side, this is a bit newer to the home builder industry as compared to operational carbon, but we're quickly learning that recipe, right? We've done a number of studies. We know what some of the design modifications are that we can do to reduce embodied carbon, mainly in concrete and steel. We know which material categories typically have the highest embodied carbon, and we know to focus our energies there. And then, looking towards the future, there's a lot of talk about mass timber, and there's code implications there. We're looking at, advanced prefabrication on the low-rise side, and how can we scale that up? And in this area specifically, we know that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done with our procurement teams and our trades and suppliers.
Interesting, Carl, that I love the phrase that you've used, that we know the recipe for the operational side. Hopefully I'm not stepping out of bounds if I say to any builder in North America, we know what it takes to get your house to zero operational carbon, whether they can market it, whether they can build it practically, what the processes that need to be in place, whether they can sell it or not. But I think we have a formula, recipe, and in fact you can adjust the recipe. Do you think that's fair from Minto's perspective? I'm not suggesting that you build all your house that way, but if any one of your divisions said we want to get there, where it's at. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. We know, almost all the technology is very proven. It's just a matter of, what's the local context, what's the site specific constraints, and then trying to work through those, right?
I see it all the time with the manufacturers. We have manufacturers in wait, right? I was just speaking with a window manufacturer. I don't mind mentioning the name, Geldwin, and they've got some new solutions, and it turns out those solutions work in a wide range of climate zones, and even I would say they were surprised at how well those products would work in even southern climates. So they're anxious to get started this, and really my point is lots of strategic partners helping with this. And Stefanie, we're going to bring you back in, but I think you would say as well that the manufacturers are working on their own ESG reports and so on, but they're ready to step up to help the industry move along. So I like the fact that we have the recipe. We're pretty settled on that. It is, as you saying here, Carl, lots to learn on the embodied carbon side. I'm frankly kind of excited about it. I've said a bunch of times, the embodied carbon software that I see Chris Magwood and others have worked on is eerily similar to the early days of Hot 2000 and software on energy. Still some questions. I wonder how we model this. I wonder where we're going with that. But so I'm excited, as I think you are, Carl, to see what works, what moves the needle, and so on.
Yeah, and I think to what Stefanie said before, like we need builder engagement as early as possible in these things. So embodied carbon is a perfect example of that, of where we can become more engaged on that topic.
And Stefanie, I think you would agree in your current role and previous roles that the recipe is there, but you're going to take us to that next step if you wouldn't mind from there.
Sure, no problem. So so now I'm putting on my Intercan hat, and I'm going to walk you through some work that very gratefully Carl, along with a number of other people, have helped to formulate. But before I talk about it, just to give everyone an idea of what LEAP does, and so I know you introduced us earlier. So LEAP, or Local Energy Efficiency Partnership, the way I describe LEAP is we're sort of a bridge between policy and boots on the ground. So we are within the government, within Natural Resources Canada, but we take policy and codes and the direction that things are moving, and create resources for the industry with input from the industry that is useful for the industry to help the industry transition to new codes and new things that are coming down the pipe. And then when industry raises issues or asks for help on things, we go and help to create the resources that they need to help them succeed. And so that's what the LEAP's role is. And so what I'm going to do is walk you through now the integration of adaptation and mitigation with a tool that I've been working on within my role at LEAP. And this tool was born out of not only kind of the backstory that I shared about earlier with what I was learning, but also personal experiences in industry, and also a pretty significant gap in the marketplace where there was not a tool that did this, that exists. And so it is novel. So anyways, let's talk about it. So first of all, as I mentioned, Carl was part of this this initiative. I was very fortunate to be able to bring together 5 different groups from the government. So ECCC, which is our climate scientists, NRC, the group that builds the building code, HICC, which was formerly known as Infrastructure Canada. Now they've got houses and communities as part of their role, Canada Mortgage and Housing, and the us from NRCan, plus 4 of Canada's largest residential builders, Canadian Homebuilders Association, ICLR, which is the research arm of the insurance industry, the Insurance Industry Association, so IBC, and also a group from the Building Officials Association. So it was very deliberately a cross-sector group of people, multiple stakeholders coming together to do something that hasn't been developed before, so that we could not only have everybody be able to hear each other's opinions and perspectives, but also to create some level of alignment in something that is can be kind of complex when you begin to think about the home of 2030. So let's imagine the home of 2030. We're going to be, at least on the National Building Code side, Tier 5, right? We're going to be not only dealing with operational carbon, which is being introduced in 2025, but then embodied carbon, which is being introduced in 2030, or that's the plan. And then we're going to start layering on adaptation measures. So we know that overheating is being looked at, and there are certain new things that are being added to the existing building code as it relates to resilience, but then potentially even additional things, particularly around wildfire, flooding, and high wind, as an example, and hail. So we're beginning to see some movement around that front. And so you imagine the home of 2030, what happens when you try to take all those things and put them into one single house, right? And so there hasn't been something that brought that together. And so this is what we're attempting to do. And so I showed you this slide before, and I just wanted to highlight that particularly on the far right side, you'll see this year alone, we've already exceeded the worst year in Canadian history for insurable losses. And interestingly, and of course, wildfire and flooding, the Toronto floods and the Jasper wildfire have made the news with pushing $1 billion each in insurable losses. But what was really interesting, and this is for housing and automotive, but the hailstorm in Calgary on August 5th alone was $2.8 billion in insurable losses. And so clearly, that is not a sustainable thing. And because, as we already talked about, insurance is such a critical part of how our housing works, there's actions that are being taken and being explored on all sides, including from investors. And Gord, to your earlier comment about Desjardins, yeah, they said they were no longer offering mortgages to people in those flood risk areas because they were at high risk. So you'll notice that map on the left side, I had earlier mentioned about how certain areas will get hit with multiple hazards. And so here's an example, like when you're looking at Nova Scotia, where they've had wildfire, flooding, hurricanes, and other places that have been hit with different hazards. And when we think to ourselves, if you lose the home, if you build the home to net zero and say you're in a wildfire area and you make it wildfire resilient, but then you still lose it to the hurricane or to the flood, we're still no farther ahead. So we do need to start thinking about, what are the hazards that we need to prioritize all collectively together, while also looking at the energy and the carbon in the conversation. Here's some pictures from this year alone. So the flood in Toronto, the wildfire in Jasper, and then the hail in Calgary, and the type of losses that we're seeing on an escalating basis. So the LEAP Sustainable Resilient Home Tool, as I mentioned, is a first of its kind, so it is novel. It is builder and renovator centric. So we've designed this for the builder and renovator market, and it's been informed by the market. It's guiding people and builders and renovators through being able to navigate complex information. And it really begins to explore the buildability and affordability of these measures, not only on their own, but as we stitch them together, thinking of applying them in a single house. But what it also does, because as Carl mentioned, we are having this conversation early before it's already being proposed in codes, we are able to gather information from the building community to understand what the costs are, what challenges or barriers they might be, that will then funnel back to the same stakeholders that you saw, the people that are building the building codes and the climate scientists and others, so that they can be informed from the boots on the ground feedback on what happens when we integrate all this together. So the tool there's 5 modules within it. So the first module, you put your location in, and then it tells you what your hazards are in that area. So it screens in the hazards that are relevant for you. Then next, it takes those hazards and say what happens to the building because of that hazard. So on overheating or on high wind, what happens to the building and the components within the building. So it has a list of risks that are in there, but of course you can always add more within the tool because it's an Excel-based tool. It then takes those same hazards that we screened in that we know are relevant for the area and looks at the land around the building and possible solutions to help adapt to the hazard, because the land around the building can often have a big impact when you're thinking about climate change. Imagine flooding. It doesn't always just happen solely within the house. It's, something that happens around. Wind. You can get wind tunnels and that sort of thing. So wildfires, another example. So it looks at the land around the building. And then module 4 is where it really gets into the nitty gritty. And this is where for each of the 13 hazards that we have built into the tool, it applies, where available, a standard or a best practice guideline. And this was given to us from the NRC, so the folks that build the building code, as well as ICLR, who are the research arm of the insurance industry. So we asked them, give us what you think is the best standard or guideline or best practice guidance that we will build into the tool. And part of the reason for requesting them to do it, not only are they the experts in this, but also if those are perceived to be the best, those are probably the ones that would be looked at for potential building codes. So we wanted to have these early conversations with the builders to get their input on this. And then lastly, module 5 is where it stitches it all together. So to clarify, in module 4, this is where we're looking at hazard by hazard separately, and sort of stitching together the energy, the carbon, and that specific hazard. Then we say in module 5, the energy, the carbon, and the relevant hazards for your area all stitched together into one large matrix. So just to give you a bit of a visual, this, the map on the left shows, okay, I'm located in, southwestern Ontario or something like that. And then it will automatically screen in. You'll see it says very relevant. It will screen in what hazards are relevant for your area. And then it will take those hazards and it will specify what happens to the building based on those hazards. And then it looks at, again, with those same hazards, it provides context on the land around the house and outlines what things you could do to help make the home more protected from those particular hazards. And then in module 4, this is where, again, just like I mentioned, it digs into specific measures that are based on the information that we've received. Now, there are not necessarily standards or best practice guidelines for all of the hazards yet. Work is being done, but we have included the ones that do exist, and where they don't exist, we have received information that we can put in for best practice. And so what we're doing in this module here is not only are we looking at the specific measures to address that particular hazard, but we're also looking at the energy and the carbon piece and trying to link together to say, are there co-benefits? So if I, for example, am building in an area that is wildfire prone, instead of using, say, an exterior foam insulated sheathing, I'm using a stone wool material. It provides energy savings because it's an insulation on the outside of the house, but it also provides a level of fire resistance. As an example, so we look at, are there co-benefits, or are there potentially what we call maladaptations, so things that don't work together, so they kind of fight one another, and which leads you to sort of a trade-off situation. And so we're wanting to really kind of understand and uncover this because this is gaps in information that needs to be understood. And then of course the affordability, so looking at the cost of all of this. So if you go into module 4, you will see that there are good, better, best. And so the idea here is that best is the full and complete standard. So if you were to buy a product, a digital product, and you've got the best, the most expensive version has all the features, but you can get the good one, but it maybe only has a few of the features, and then there's the middle section. That's the sort of idea where best is the full and complete standard or best practice guideline, and good and better are segments of. And so we're just working through that right now, but this is the approach that we have taken. And I'll just move to the next slide. And so the other thing in module 4 is that some work has been done on developing technical sheets for wildfire by my colleague Lucas, who's championing the wildfire resistant housing and net zero work for the LEAP team. And so he's developed some technical sheets, and he's working with NRC on those. And I know that NRC, along with ICLR, are also working on this same sort of concept for some of the other hazards. And so that's will be hopefully coming soon. And of course, those create a great foundation for workshops and other resources. And so, as I mentioned in module 5, this is where we stitch it all together. So we identified the hazards, we've identified the measures that we're going to look at, we've identified what the impact from the energy and the carbon is, and then we analyze all of those together to understand what is the best way forward, where are there challenges, where are there barriers, and that information, as I mentioned, gets funneled back so that we can share this information back with people that are developing policy for decision making, and for others, obviously for industry as well. So just to give you a bit of a rundown on the plans for the toolkit, and then I'll talk about the case study and then wrap up from there. But the version 1 of the tool is very comprehensive. And the reason we did that is because we wanted to sort of lay all the cards on the table, if you will, and get all the information on the table so that we made sure that we had a good flow and that we weren't missing anything. So the first version, or version 1 of the tool, is very comprehensive, and we're wrapping that up very soon. And then we're developing what we call a light tool. So if you don't want to get into all the weeds, it's a easier interface. And Carl's laughing because he knows it's very detailed, the current comprehensive tool. So it'll have a lighter interface and be a little bit easier, give you high level. It won't have the same utility, but at least it'll get you there. It'll give you an idea of the things to look for. We're developing a guide book as well as workshops. And then my colleague Patrick and I are starting a case study project. And we're in early conversations about potentially developing an app where we will, prior to potentially doing an app, though, we will be linking this tool with outputs from the embodied carbon tool so that we can so HOT 2000 can feed to the MCE squared tool so that we can have our energy and carbon outputs, which will then get input into this tool to pre-populate. So that's sort of the big master plan, and then potentially putting it into an app. But on the case studies, just really quickly, and then this is my last slide, what we want to do is show proof of concept, because like I said, this is new, it is novel, and it is comprehensive. And so we are running, we're starting with a series of 5 regional case studies, because each region has different climate zones, different weather patterns, different climate hazards, different building practices, different supply chains. So there's so many different variables. So we're starting with 5 different regions, each region having 5 builders, renovators participating, and we are going to go through this entire process with them over a 5 or 6 month period of time. And with the plans to extend it to an additional 15 regions, so that there can be representation in every single province and territory, with some of the provinces having multiple regions represented in the case study project. So a total of 100 individual builder renovator case study outcomes from that. Now I'm going to stop.
Well, I wasn't hoping that you would stop. I had a couple of questions for you.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure you said the number specifically, but I think you mentioned to me before. How many different hazard, let's call them categories, are there?
There's many, depending on how granular you want to get. So I don't even know what the actual number is. I just know that I've seen very large lists. What we have focused in on is 13, 4 of which are related to flooding. So we've segmented out flooding into storm water flooding. So that's basically flooding based on just an infrastructure issue, versus river flooding, versus coastal flooding, versus lake flooding. So we have those as 4 different ones. And then the remainder of our 13 are the others related to wind, storms, overheating, wildfire, etc. We did prioritize the top 5, which are the most prolific, I guess, would perhaps be the right word. It's overheating, wildfire, flooding, extreme heat, and wind being kind of the big ones.
Thank you for that. And I certainly those have huge emotion, and there's nothing more terrifying than the pictures we've seen, the videos we've seen of fire and flood. So obviously that's got to be top of mind. That's pretty interesting. I was joking a little bit, laughing a little bit when you were chatting that you're going to have an app like that. Everybody's got to have an app. What I'm trying to decide is which of the 3 apps that I currently have do I remove in order to get this one? Because I've vowed in my lifespan I'm only going to have 3 apps on my phone. So that's just me trying to be funny.
That's a very noble attempt at.
We also got the question, I think you kind of answered, but just more specifically, somebody was asking, is the tool currently available even in its draft form?
So we have been sharing it with some people to get their input on it. So certainly reach out to me. I can put my email in the chat. Reach out to me, and then we can I can show it to you, demonstrate it for you, and then we can talk about that. Yeah. Sure. It's not publicly available, like meaning it's not on the government website or anything like that. It has to come through being sent directly, because it's not at that stage where it can be publicly shared on the website.
I really like the idea of the adding in the current standards, and some may say it's not complete, they're not accurate, but it's really nice to have a running start at this to say, hey, there's been some great work done by many. Having sat on 2 or 3 CSA committees, you always like to assume your work is going to get used. And I'm sure there's lots of folks who've been on these CSA committees and guidebooks to say, boy, I'm glad we've got a place where builders are pointed to. And Carl, I know you were part of the committee that was helping develop the tool. I know you wanted to make some comments on that, and then a little sense of how you're making out with respect to your adaptation, mitigation, adaptation strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Gordon. I think, Stefanie was caught me laughing at the light tool, and we're excited for that. But I think not every builder has somebody like me whose mandate is sustainability. I want the comprehensive tool. I want to go through in as much detail as possible. But this, that program also needs to appeal to those builders and renovators and whoever else just don't have those internal resources. So I'm going to get into what Minto is currently doing around adaptation. so yeah, we can keep going through this one here. It's frozen on my, there we go. Yeah, so I think I mentioned it before, like climate resilience, it's really the new frontier for builders, right? We've talked about operational carbon, embodied carbon, all those sorts of things. Now we need to figure out, climate change is happening. It's putting our assets and our customers at risk and our communities at risk. So this is where we need to be putting a lot of effort, right, into the future. Where we started is sort of exactly what Stefanie laid out, right? Like defining our climate risks for each product in each region that we build, right? I mentioned we're across the country, we're in the southeastern US, we've got all kinds of different product types and typologies. So we need to understand, what's our baseline today, what are we building today, and what factors need to be improved to make our homes more resilient. So part of that is we've put together resilience framework for all of our new developments, looking at, what are we doing today? Where are there gaps? What can we be doing in the future, and sort of framing that for whenever we're working on a new community. I've laid out some of the challenges here. I think we might even have some of the same pictures that Stefanie used before. But the risks in Calgary are very different from Ontario and very different from Florida, for an example. There are some similarities for sure, so we can also collaborate between our teams, because everywhere is going to have a different standard. They're going to have different construction norms. They have different codes. So how can we work together to see what we're all doing in each of our little silos? And there is a lot of research. We saw a lot of those guidance documents and standards and technical details. We've seen tons of technical details and drawings and all those sorts of things. But how do we get that real world feedback from trades, our site teams, suppliers, manufacturers, and really see how these things can be implemented, in the most optimized way possible, and how can we work together to sort that out. And we talked about future insurability as a core concern around mortgages, insurance, insurability, all that kind of stuff. And then obviously industry engagement. Minto takes a strong stance on being engaged and involved in a lot of this work in these programs as early as possible. So we're very excited about the LEAP tool and how we can use that on upcoming communities. And if we go to the next two slides, again, there's going to be a lot of information on them. This is sort of our first kick at the can of looking at what our adaptation strategies are and what our current status is at Minto for some of these. Essentially, the LEAP tool is a much more comprehensive version of this, which we did, a couple years ago, right? So this is very high level. Again, rolling up a lot of those risks into sort of more broad categories. We're talking about wildfire, flooding, hail, storms, wind, but obviously it's much more nuanced than that when you start to roll it out over different regions and product types. So this is just a sample of what we've done on the high-rise side, and then the next slide will show what's happening or what we've done on the low-rise side. And again, you can see we've sort of put that matrix together of which regions are most impacted and which areas are they most relevant for. And if we keep rolling to my final slide here, I believe, this is really looking to the future, right? So, the first couple here, it's more the past. So, we've done baseline energy analysis around operational embodied carbon. We've done, it says measure embodied carbon for 2 to 4 new developments, but that's essentially our new standard. We create that baseline and analysis on every new community. We defined a lot of the resilience features to include in new developments. It doesn't mean we're necessarily committing to them right away. We are a for-profit builder. We still need to make the pro formas work, but at least we know what we can be doing, and then see where it might make the most sense, today. We do something else, decarbonization studies on all new developments. So that's just taking a step back early on and saying, what are all the potential heating and cooling source scenarios? You know, is it conventional natural gas, business as usual? Are we going to a hybrid air source heat pump solution? Are we going geo exchange? Are we going all electric? And that just sort of forces us to question that business as usual and that status quo and say, okay, can we be doing anything better from a mitigation perspective? And then, you know, this year we're really focused on, you know, let's set some corporate performance targets on some of these things, right? Like we need to, you know, all align again around those different product types and regions and say, you know, okay, we need to have some sort of consistency here across the business for our reputation, for our brand, for our customers. And then, you know, we're also looking at from that list of sort of minimum resilience features, like how can we set a minimum requirement around some of those resiliency and adaptation features? And, you know, on high rise, it could be things like making sure we have a place of refuge in case of severe weather events, so that those in the building that are most at risk have a place to go, whether it's to you know, store medication or potable water if it's not, you know, available in the rest of the building, those sorts of things. And then looking to 2025, we're looking to set some of those embodied carbon targets. And then, you know, our current generation of ESG objectives and targets are coming up or expiring in 2025. So we've got to look at, you know, ESG 2.0 as we're calling it. What are the next step of priorities? And we know for a fact climate resiliency is a huge part of that. So that's sort of where we're heading in the future there.
Thanks very much, Carl. It's a really nice element. I think, Stefanie, you would say, just to kind of put a point on this, what we're seeing here is primarily mitigation strategies. Is that fair on this screen in terms of their roadmap?
Well, I would say, well, I do see the mitigation and the adaptation, because they are talking about, you know, bringing in the resilience into that conversation. So I would say it's a combination of both. Yeah.
Fair enough. The specifics, and what I liked you highlighting was the specifics of adaptation. What exactly are we going to do? And I think it is interesting. I'll just make a couple of comments. You know, I do work throughout the United States. I was in Chicago not too long ago, and in Chicago, it's still a requirement in the city downtown center, at least the Chicago itself, that all wiring is, even in residential, is done inside a conduit. You can't just run standard wire. And that really dates back to 150 years ago when a cow kicked over a lantern and most of Chicago burned down. That has set the tone for Chicago building codes for over 150 years. Plumbing is still cast iron and copper pipe, no plastic waste pipes. We see this in California, of course, where much of their codes is driven around the seismic issues. And so we've already got a long history of codes that have responded, at least the building industry responding to natural disasters. So it shouldn't be seen as something new. What I like is, and Stefanie, please comment, if you want to go back to slide 56, for example, just as we take some questions, understanding that this kind of roadmap that you've laid out, I was just thinking that's a pretty nice one that just kind of gives the adaptation and mitigation, and that you guys are becoming this really nice clearinghouse of resources to help builders through this. Yeah, I like, Carl, what you were saying is the regionality. On one hand, the industry is very regional. On the other hand, that does create stress, I'm sure, for a large company like Minto that's trying to help divisions do different things. Have you seen, I'll just ask a couple of questions on that front. What have you seen? Are the divisions pleased with the idea that they can respond to these on a regional basis, or do you think that makes it more difficult that you're not going company-wide?
No, I mean, I think, you know, all the discussions that we've had, like each division wants their flexibility, right? They know their market, they know their customers, they know their climate risk because they live in that area. They've had their house damaged by hail, they've had their car destroyed. Like they live these things, right? I'm here in Southern Ontario, so we, you know, where we are relatively safe compared to things like out west with wildfires and hail and all that. So they totally want that flexibility in the approach. And you know, I think everyone at a fundamental level understands the importance of climate change. I think maybe there's a lot of folks that just don't know what they can do about it. whether personally or in their role, right?
Yeah, I've told, it doesn't work very well, but I've told builders everywhere, you should really just move to Ontario. That hasn't been an answer for most builders, but you get the idea. We seem to be at lower risk here, although we've seen more tornadoes and floods
Yeah.
and so on. It's pretty interesting. Stefanie, there's a specific question in the questions about retrofit from Ken. Wondering about the overlap on retrofit works and how does this work in old buildings? What do you see the tool being valuable, and how applicable is this entire conversation to the remodel or renovation world?
Well, having been a renovator for 15 years, I certainly didn't want to leave them behind. And so this tool is really designed for both new home builders and renovators. And so the reason for that, and it is sort of a bit of an assumption, if you will. The way homes are built today are certainly, different than how they were previously, but they don't necessarily have the measures that the standards have, like that these standards that we're pointing to have. And so whether it's an older home or a newer home, it might not have the same level of resilience to that particular hazard. So in thinking about it, I thought that they were probably starting from potentially a similar, maybe not entirely the same, but a similar starting point as it relates to some of the hazards, like, for example, wildfire or wind. And the other thing, there was something else I was going to say about it, but it's just escaping me at the moment. Anyway, I'll come back to it because it will come to me. But anyways, I do think that it's, I did not want to leave the renovators behind. This does include both, I know what it was. The hazard is the hazard, whether it's a new home or it's an existing home. So if you're going to have a tornado come through, it's going to be a new home or an existing home. It doesn't really matter. The hazard's the hazard. So for both of those reasons, that's why it's designed to work for Part 9 housing. It's designed for Part 9 housing. We have talked about in a future iteration of it looking at layering on phased approaches. So imagine if you're living in an existing home and you're in an area that is high wind, but you're not planning on removing all the siding on your house, but you are needing to re-roof, for example. What a good time to do some additional measures. As you take the old shingles off, you can seal up the roof sheathing so that water doesn't get in should shingles fly off. If you're in a hail zone as well, you could use better shingles that address hail, and then you could also put more nails in to secure the nails in the high wind based on those sorts of standards. So potentially a phased approach that could be applied to existing housing in a future iteration of the tool.
Thank you. And then Carl, back to you just for a second. In your work, I really love the way Stefanie mapped out from problem identification to research to early development and then standards and ultimately towards regulation. There was a question about, when does this stuff end up being in code? I think Minto would say you would try to go early, but I presume you also need to talk to consumers and see what their tolerance is for, or interest and tolerance is for dollars. Have you addressed consumers yet? Have you started down that path to see what their interest might be?
Yeah, we haven't done any sort of formal research into really dig deep in customer sentiments around climate change, but I think it's probably an easier sell than sustainability or net zero, to be honest. Like we know, we've sold net zero homes in the past and we focus around enhanced performance, comfort. We have talked about resiliency, a better product, better quality. So I think, climate resilience and adaptation features fit perfectly with that, right? And that's what we found to really resonate with purchasers.
And thank you. We found during COVID, for example, lots of interest, lots of dollars spent in schools and buildings and in houses with respect to air quality. And a part of me wants to say, boy, you should have thought of it before. Why have I been talking about this for 30 years and you're never interested? At the same time, I think we have to take the win without preying on the vulnerable and saying, boy, the hailstorm came, you don't want that to happen. You know, a pretty simple choice, right, of a better cladding system could go a long way. So that's pretty interesting. So you have to play that balance about preying on the fears of folks, but at the same time helping them make good decisions. Stefanie, at LEAP at the government level, has that been a concern? How much you tie into, would you start marketing based on disasters?
Well, I'm not sure about that exactly, but we are having conversations around the integration of mitigation and adaptation. And so when, so some of the concerns, that I have is like articulated one where it was, your efforts on the energy side are undermined when you lose the house. But the other thing is in an environment where you have limited budget, which everybody has, affordability is a key concern. And you're up against these acute physical risks, like Carl talked about, wildfire and flooding, etc. You can easily imagine, and it's very relatable and very tangible, these hazards and risks. You can imagine that people will gravitate towards spending their money on the adaptation and the resilience, perhaps in absence of the mitigation and the energy side. And so really, we need to have it as a dual conversation, because you'll remember in that positive feedback or that reinforcing feedback loop I showed, that if we don't stop creating the emissions that are helping to create the climate change, then we're just going to have to build more and more and more resilience into the homes, essentially. So, or perhaps as a sort of a rudimentary logic step there.
Right. There's a quick question there from Sarah, and I'll just reiterate, Sarah, that the draft tool is available. Stefanie put a link to her email that she could get you some version of it, and that there are tools coming in the spring, so you'd watch for those. So there's that ability. Sandra has asked, and I know it's slightly different, Sandra, but do we know when the code change is going to take place? She's specifically asking about the energy code and in Ontario. Some of you would know that Ontario decided not to adopt the energy section of the National Building Code, at least for now. I haven't heard if anybody else has an answer on that. We knew it would be at least a year before they'll get back looking at it. I was doing a training session today, and I was kind of outlining how I think it's unfortunate that Ontario didn't adopt it, but that's maybe an opinion on my part, and we can debate that one. What I want to make sure we finish up with is a lot of work's already been done. And if I could go back to that same conversation I said earlier of the early days of energy efficiency, even though we didn't know all the answers back in the 80s with respect to efficiency, and we didn't have all of the technologies available to us, there was still builders who got started on it, right? The research that was done in the 70s became the R2000 program. About 6,000 builders took the trend and immediately started making changes. And Stefanie, I was just interested, do you think, are we okay? Are builders able to get started? Are there things that they could do cost effectively now? Maybe not in all 13 hazard elements, but are you feeling confident that there's enough there that builders could get started?
Certainly. And I don't know that builders would need to do all 13, because to Carl's point, wildfire, for example, is not necessarily relevant in all areas of the country, but there are certain things that might be relevant in your area. So the good news is you hopefully wouldn't need to have to address all 13, but maybe just a handful of them. And absolutely, like in all the years that I've worked in the construction industry and had the privilege of serving with the CHBA and all of that. One thing that I've always appreciated and admired about the building industry is their willingness to step up and to experiment and try new things and try to help figure these things out. So I have every faith. I know, I already know, because I've already been working with a handful of the builders already in trying to develop this novel idea. So certainly I think we're in a good place with some really great people.
And Carl, I'll ask you to comment as well. You were saying you've got the recipe for operational carbon, working on the recipe for embodied on this climate area. I wanted to ask you specifically, one of the reasons you said you felt you needed to be doing it is because your reputation's at stake. I think you'd agree, though, that reputation has been built on being a bit of a leader in doing these kinds of things. You were a leader in energy efficiency in the early days of R2000. How far out there do you think you are? Like, are you seeing other builders that you speak to interested? Do you have folks coming along with you, or are you feeling out in the wilderness on this?
No, there's definitely a momentum across the industry, right? I mean, there's 3 other large builders in this this LEAP steering committee group, and we're all aligned. We're all on the same page, seeing the same things. We see that again, like climate resilience, like, is the next frontier for builders, and I think working together and getting everyone to come along on that journey, I think is huge, and that's sort of the way that we're all approaching it. I think we're competitors on the sales side, but we all share information behind the scenes around, okay, how can we best implement this detail or that detail, or what kind of costing are you guys getting on some of these things? Like, we're sharing that information because this is an issue for humanity, not for each builder or just an industry, right?
And then Karen asked in the chat, Karen, I wasn't going to read it because you're supposed to put your question in the Q&A. I'm kidding a little bit, but in the chat, she was asking, are affordable building practice being incorporated into these recommendations, or will these adaptations going to cost builders and therefore homeowners a lot more? I think I can start by saying it's going to vary by what is your standard now. But Stefanie, I'll just ask it in the LEAP toolkit, how's it looking? Is it going to be affordable, or at least some of the measures going to be affordable?
So that is exactly what we're trying to explore. That is precisely what we're trying to explore. These things can cost more, especially if you were to institute an entire, all the details in the standard, but we need to know what those costs are. So with the case study project that I talked about, we are beginning to have that conversation with the builders to begin to understand these costs and look at those, working with the insurance industry and the builders and others, looking at are there certain things, how I showed the good, better, and best, are there things like you should do, like if you have a limited budget, well, at least do this, right? Or if you've got a little bit more budget, then maybe you can do a little bit more. And so that's sort of how we're pursuing having the conversation around the affordability piece, because at this stage, I don't know. I don't know what the costs are to it specifically. And particularly when you consider that price and different things price is different in different regions. So ask me in a year or so, I'll have more information.
And Carl, that's exactly why, as you say, you're sharing information and looking for things that are affordable. Any specific comments right now in terms of affordability? We just have about 3 minutes left. And
Yeah,
Stefanie,
no,
I'll get you to go to the last slides, just since you're running the slides.
Yeah, I'd just echo that, right? Like, there's varying costs for different product types, and there's a proposition, right, of the value that a certain item at a certain cost provides, and how it is perceived by customers, right? I mean, there's no there's no question that affordability is a major issue across the board, and we're competing the cost of decarbonization versus the cost of climate resiliency versus the cost of everything else in the world today. So we are acutely aware of that. But we need to work out creative ways together to figure this out and come up with solutions that make sense.
And I get to play old guy experience. I said, I'll go right back to that energy analysis. In the early days, HRVs were a key component. I was told they were unaffordable back then. I was just looking the other day, I was cleaning up in my office. The wholesale cost of an HRV in 1986 is exactly the same as the wholesale cost of an HRV in 2024. The price of houses has gone up tenfold, and yet the price of an HRV at wholesale is exactly the same in hard dollars. So the sooner you guys get at this stuff, the sooner we get more resilient products, the more cost effective it will become. So thank you for that. I'll just take the last minute to say thank you very much, Stefanie and Carl. isn't it kind of cool, folks who are still on the call? Boy, here, we're in pretty good hands here. We've got somebody at the government level who's studying for her PhD, who has that background from the renovator side. So Stefanie, thanks for stepping in on this, being respectful of the building industry. And Carl, thanks as a large builder representative, sharing the information that you're using. I know that Minto and Madame and others have been so generous in sharing the information. So I'll just ask everybody to give you because I'm an in-person guy, I'll just give you a rousing round of applause if you wouldn't mind, everybody. Thank you for that. And while you're doing that, I'll just remind you that this is part of a series, the Critical Canadian Building Science series. And the next session is with Trevor Trainer, just a wonderful engineer with Bowating Building Science, who's going to talk to us about hydrothermal modeling using WUFI, which really puts a really nice theoretical point, which then ends up being really practical of how things like 6 mil poly and insulated sheathings impact the performance of walls. And I think we go to the next slide, if you wouldn't mind. So join us for that. And then if you're not already signed up, our Builders Digest, we'd love you to be part of that, looking for things like if you're looking for industry highlights and so on. And again, I just want to I think there's one more slide perhaps, or is there? Yes, I just want to thank everybody again for attending, and most importantly, thanking our sponsor, Enbridge, who just does such a nice, respectful job of allowing us to share with the industry pretty cool stuff. And this one is, I just so look forward to this, after 40 years, 37 years, to see this follow along. So Stefanie, Carl, thanks very much again. I really appreciate you being here and sharing the information.
Thanks, Gord.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thanks, folks, and we'll cut it at that point.